How you doing? Sorry, didn't see you there. I was just listening to some Genesis. Nothing to see here. I actually have some videotapes to return later, so I don't have much time. But it's nice for you to drop by. I guess since you're here, we might as well talk about American Psycho. Since, apropos of nothing, I just happened to read it. I don't know if it's the spirit Halloweens that keep popping up around me or really what it is, but for some reason I just felt like reading the novel of American Psycho, which obviously preceded the movie. But I had never read it before, and I guess it was just on my mind, and I decided to pick it up and read it. The movie that I'm sure everyone has seen came out in 2000, but the book came out in 1991. Now, I was not alive in 1991, so I can't tell you what it was like when the book came out, but I think it was quite the polarizing book at the time, and certainly I can see why. But I want to briefly put aside all the usual talking points around American Psycho and talk about American Psycho in the context of the world we live in today and the kind of media that we engage with today, particularly around office spaces and workplace culture. I thought it was interesting how at the Emmys recently, so many of the shows that did well were shows like Severance, shows that are based around a kind of Kafkaesque nightmare of a take around American workplaces and offices and cubicle spaces and things like that. And it's interesting reading the book and the movie to a certain extent as well, but the book particularly in that context as a book that kind of tackles all the same things that those more contemporary pieces of, in this case, TV, do. Maybe in a completely different way, but attacking the shallowness of it and the vapidness of it and the soullessness of it and the repetitiveness of it and, you know, all of the things that you can very rightly accuse American, particularly American workplace spaces as being. Obviously, American Psycho is famous for a lot more than that, but I feel like you can definitely make the case, at least in my opinion, that a lot of our contemporary media, even in things like Severance, could be seen as following in the footsteps of a book like this. Even, of course, if they're not nearly as bloody or perverted and messed up as this book is. But regardless, if you clicked on this video, you probably want to know how the book American Psycho compares to the movie American Psycho, since American Psycho is famous. And it's infiltrated pop culture in a really unique way because there's so many memes that have been generated from that movie, which are hilarious. There's a myriad of iconic scenes that come out of that movie. And so obviously the question would be how does it compare with the book? And before I answer that, the first thing I'll say is I was pretty shocked at how faithful the book or the movie was to the book in the scenes that it showed, because a lot of what you see in the movie is in the book. But in aggregate, I think if you take a step back, I think that the novel is probably just a lot more successful than the movie is, if only because there's a lot more to it and there's a lot more material in the book. Because when you compare the two, the movie has these scenes that are just pitch perfect renderings of certain scenes in the book, which are awesome, but they don't mean as much because there's very little context to them. In the book, there's a lot more context to a lot of the scenes that, again, I think are rendered very well in the movie, but in the book they mean more because there's a greater context with the characters that are in the scene and what's going on in Bateman's life and, you know, things like that. Ultimately, I think it's funny, my appreciation of the movie was actually deepened by the book, even though I think that the book is better than the movie, because I was just surprised at how well the movie was able to render these scenes. For example, the most famous scene probably from the movie is the business card comparison scene. And the way that it reads in the book is just perfectly described in the way that it's acted and executed in the movie. So in that particular case, the scene itself might be better than that individual scene in the book, or at least might make for a more effective scene in the movie than it does in the book. But in context and in the whole, I think in a lot of cases, the book succeeds where the movie fails. Because I think at the end of the day, the movie feels kind of plotless at times. I mean, it just kind of moves along. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the movie. I've watched it before. I think I've watched it twice now, and I like certain aspects of it, but I'm usually pretty ambivalent toward the movie. And I think part of the reason for that is that it follows the general structure of the book, but without a lot of the context that makes certain scenes that the movie dramatizes from the book make sense within, the proper context of the rest of the story. For example, in the movie, Reese Witherspoon's character, Evelyn, who plays Patrick Bateman's girlfriend, the scene in which the two of them break up in the movie is very similar to how it's portrayed in the book, but in the movie it feels like it's largely just a joke, and it is, of course, that way also in the book, but you've spent a lot more time with Evelyn as a character. In the movie, she's in it for all of 2 minutes, so you don't really see who this character is or what their relationship is like. In the book, you spend a lot more time with her and their relationship, and it's not like when you're reading the book, you're like, oh, my favorite couple are breaking up, that's so sad. It's like, no, that's not how it goes off at all. But again, I think context is key. Another good example is when Bateman goes to choke or strangle Lewis in the bathroom, and Lewis turns around and thinks that Patrick Bateman is like coming on to him, and is obviously like super happy about that, and reveals that he's always liked Patrick and everything like that. And obviously Patrick is freaked out and horrified and runs away. In the movie, once again, that's sort of played off as a joke, but in the book, that scene, while it does happen again, very similar to how it happens in the movie, and again, the movie is very faithful on all that, but that scene has a lot more legs to it because it gets brought up again and again after that, and much more to do is made about it, and a lot more implications are meant to be drawn from that scene that are a lot clearer in the book than they are in the movie, or at least I never picked up on them because I just thought it was meant to be a joke. Of course, the other major difference between the book and the movie is that the movie is far, far less gratuitously violent and sexual than the book is, which might be surprising to say, but I mean, honestly, if you've seen the movie, you know that a lot of that violence is implied. It happens off screen. You're not seeing a ton in terms of gore and guts and things being torn out of people's bodies, and in the book, it's so much more violent. I understand that the movie probably could never show the extent of the violence that is in the book, and the same thing goes for the sex scenes in the book. It's just overall a lot more lewd and graphic than you'll find in the movie. That doesn't necessarily make the book better, of course. I mean, just because something can be violent and disturbing doesn't mean that it's necessarily good. And I do think that there are some genuinely really boring chapters in the book, particularly a chapter called Another Night, which is designed clearly to be boring and tedious because it traces a boring and tedious another night in Bateman's life, which is basically a never-ending phone call between various people who are all trying to figure out where they want to go for dinner, and they are, of course, being as vapid and shallow and horrible to each other as you can possibly imagine. But as you're being dragged along in that conversation, all of the tedium of that conversation is sort of transferred to you, the reader, and it makes for a very, very slow chapter. And I will say that in general, I mean, I think the book might suffer a little bit from its own success, considering the fact that Patrick Bateman is not a new character. We already kind of know who this guy is, even if you haven't watched the movie, and the world that Patrick Bateman inhabits is a world that we're familiar with as well. This kind of mixing of reality with this nightmarish, aesthetics and whatnot is at this point a pretty familiar thing. Again, referencing those shows like Severance and whatnot. So the point is that this whole setup of this book is not necessarily new at this point, and so you don't necessarily in the 21st century need to be eased into it, or at least I didn't feel like I needed to be eased into it. I don't know how a reader at the time would have felt if this was all just so strange to them that they would need a kind of grace period to kind of get used to what's going on. But certainly the first third of the book, I think, is quite slow, especially if you're coming at it from the perspective of having watched the movie or just being familiar with the story just in general. Of course, another big aspect of American Psycho is whether or not Bateman actually, did all of the things that he is described as doing in the book and shown as doing in the movie. And I think Ellis himself has said that it's kind of a dumb question. I think, especially after reading the book, it's kind of a dumb question because it doesn't really matter. The point of the book is that regardless of whether or not Patrick Bateman has done those things, he's an irredeemable monster either way. And I think that's the number one contribution that the book makes to any sort of larger discussion, is that you can be an irredeemable monster without doing the things that Bateman is described as having done in the book. And I think that's really interesting to think about, or at least I think that's a fair point. But in terms of the question of whether or not he actually did it, I think it's interesting being like, well, he didn't do it or he did do it. The implication being that he either did everything that he's described as doing or none of it, which I don't understand why that has to be the case. He could have done some of it, and others of it could have just been fantasized. It seems to me that there's plenty of reasons to think that some of the things that he did, he actually did, and some of the things that he is described as doing, he probably was just fantasizing about. I don't think that it has to be 100% either way. But again, the point is that this is a book about an irredeemable monster named Patrick Bateman, and the Patrick Bateman being an irredeemable monster is true whether you think all of the things that he does in the book happened or not. I think that's one of the things that the movie misses too, because so much of the movie you see him as a psycho, which is fine, but in the book you just grow sick of who he is, again, even if he isn't doing any of the things that he's described as doing, any of the murders at least, any of the horrible assaults at least. If even without all of that, you see just the vapidness of this guy, how evil he is just as a person, how meaningless his life is, how meaningless the people around him are, and I really got sick of it by the end of it. But nevertheless, I think Patrick Bateman as a character is iconic, and again, I think this book does cast a very long shadow. On the one hand, it does what it's trying to do well. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's also like not particularly enjoyable, at least for me. I mean, you're basically being tossed in between two outcomes, which is either it's extremely boring, extremely tedious, everyone is this vapid shell of a person, you hate being around them, it's just the epitome of everything that is, wrong with the world. And then on the other hand, it's gross and gratuitously violent and disgustingly sexualized and just, horrible to be around. And those are two uncomfortable places to be. And I'm not saying that it's not worth it to read it once. If you've watched the movie and you liked the movie, then I definitely would give it a recommend. But in terms of like a book that you could love and a story that you could want to spend a lot of time with and characters that you appreciate and want to spend a lot of time with, I mean, I certainly didn't find that to be the case in American Psycho at all. I think the number one thing that I appreciate about the book and the movie is the number one thing that I appreciate about a lot of the things that I enjoy, which is when they're funny. I liked it a lot when the book was funny. I like the movie when the movie is funny. And so that's something that I really appreciate for sure. I think if you're coming from the movie, you are going to have to steel yourself against the fact that it takes a while for the book to warm up. I mean, in my opinion, that's just the case. I marked it by page 130. We really start getting into our really disturbing moment. We have our first true disturbing moment, I guess, or an extended disturbing moment. The rest of it, prior to that, we have a few hints of that, but it takes a while before it really starts to get going. So yeah, I think in this case it doesn't really matter whether I'd recommend it or not, because you've probably made up your mind as to whether or not this is a book that you want to engage with or not. Either way, that's totally cool. I can totally see people, liking the book more than me. I think that I like it. It's just like, this is not an example of something that I read because this is not an example of why I read. This is an example of what I read sometimes. It's not an example of what makes me go back to the books that I go back to. Because, I don't know, there's stuff here to like, but, overall, it's not necessarily totally my cup of tea. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there for now. Thanks for watching, and I will come back with another video about something a little bit lighter soon.